Greetings and welcome, school directors, friends, and colleagues from outside of WSSDA, but within the K-12 education space. Really appreciate all of you joining for our pre-learning session in preparation for the 2024 WSSDA General Assembly, which occurs 1 week from tomorrow. And this is the fourth of 5 of our pre-learning sessions in preparation for that event. Today, we have several guest speakers who are going to be chatting with you, sharing with you a little bit about learning standards, basic education, graduation requirements, and graduation pathways. So my colleagues and friends from both OSPI and State Board of Education will be joining us. Just a reminder that we are recording today's session for those school directors who are not able to join us in real time today. Will be able to watch this as a recording and benefit from the learning as well. A little about logistics. Much of the content today will be the delivery of information for you to learn from. However, we will invite questions for our speakers as we go. If you could please put those questions in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat and keeping track of those questions as they come in. So once our presenters have completed their segments of the presentation, I'll have the opportunity to frame your questions back to them for them to answer. In the meantime, while we're waiting for our first presenter, Jenny Plaja, to come to the screen, she's logged in, but I'm going to give her a little chance to settle in because we were just in a meeting together a moment ago. I do want to show you all the WSSDA handbook and just walk you through a little bit about what to expect and answer some questions that I have heard from the field recently that may benefit you as well. Couple things, again, I just want to remind you, this may be repetitive if you've joined us before, but they say in education, you need to educate environments or groups 7 times in 7 different ways. So maybe this is number 6. So you'll probably hear it one more time. Just want to remind you, as you're reviewing the General Assembly Handbook, which really is your guide to how to participate in General Assembly, that the rules of procedure are critically important for you to review in advance of General Assembly. A lot of the questions that I'm getting via email or by phone or text are actually answered in these several pages. You'll find this in the General Assembly Handbook, pages 4 through 6, small text, so pretty juicy information, but lots of information that you'll need to have. Another thing just to note in preparation for General Assembly, whether you're joining us in person or remotely, I would ask that if you like to have a printed copy near you, it's sometimes easier to read that way, that you make that copy on your own. If for some reason you don't have access to a printer at home, go ahead and ask your school district if they're able to make that copy for you. They typically have a budget to support school board work, and this is absolutely important school board work. And you should be able to get a packet of this information printed for you at your district if you're unable to do so at home. So please have your own copy prepared. For those of you who are joining us in person, we will not make copies for in-person delegates. Also just wanted to draw your attention to the voting order, which will remain the same once we start General Assembly. You'll find the voting order here on page 13. This is the order of business, essentially, that you will be working through starting at 9 a.m. on Friday morning. So I've had a lot of questions about the schedule, and it's such a tricky question to answer because the meeting will be called to order at 9 a.m. on Friday. We'll recess at 5 p.m. on Friday, and we'll reconvene at 9 a.m. on Saturday. When you all are done on Saturday, it's anybody's guess. It all depends on how much time is deliberated for each position proposal prior to the adjournment. So there are 58 total proposals for you to navigate over the course of the 2 days. Up to 10 minutes per proposal, 5 minutes for pro, 5 minutes for con. Sometimes the full 10 minutes is utilized and sometimes it's not. So it's really difficult to gauge where we'll be and when during the proceedings, much less when you'll be done on Saturday. In the last several years, we've ended as early as I think 1 o'clock on Saturday. But I understand there have been times that we have not adjourned until 8 or 9 p.m. So again, really, really tough to gauge. If for some reason you don't think you'll be able to participate there through the end, please have another school board member prepared to stand in for you as a voting delegate. You are able to exchange your voting credentials with other members of your school board throughout the 2 days of events. So you technically could have all 5 school board members a voting delegate, but only one of you can be voting at a time. So those are some of the key questions. In the interest of time, you probably have others, but I want to be sure to give our guest speakers the ample opportunity to share what they have prepared for all of you today. And we will be talking specifically about some of the position proposals that are within the learning category and tangentially related to the staffing category. Unusual this year, there were very few position proposals submitted in the learning category and only one under staffing, predominantly under governance and funding and allocations. Those are the positions we're seeing the most of this year and actually over the last couple years. I would encourage you to also think about one of the core elements of your work as a school board member, probably also what encouraged you to be a school board member, was actually what the learning outcomes and experiences of students and staff would be as a part of leadership. So I would argue that these are the most important topics for us to be discussing. So we're saving the best for last in this regard. And I'm going to pass the mic over to my friend Jenny Plaja at OSPI to take it from here. Thanks for being here, Jenny.
Of course. Thank you so much, Marissa, and hello, everyone. Marissa, could you please enable screen sharing for me? So Jenny Plaja, I currently serve as the Chief Policy and Legislative Affairs Officer at OSPI, and I've been with you before, so good to see you all again. Those of you who I've met before, for those of you I haven't, I hope to meet you soon in person or on the Zoom screen. Let's get started. So Marissa invited me to talk a little bit about learning standards. So I'll have a little bit about the process. Let me see if I can, did that work? Are you seeing the full screen slide? Yeah, okay, good, thanks. I'll talk a little bit about the process, but also putting it into context with like basic education in Washington and kind of the different roles. I don't know how deep we all want to go today, but I have a little bit of time. So I'm going to bounce around a little bit and then can be available for questions. And I know Marissa is very knowledgeable in all of this as well. So we can tag team it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about basic education and the importance of learning standards, kind of frame it for us of what the requirements are and why we're doing this. I'll talk a little bit about the project goals and process, very briefly on the public comment period, just because that is the point of the process we are in right now, and a little bit on next steps. So the Constitution outlines the basic structures and functions of government. So the executive branch, legislative branch, judicial. It's organized in a way. Article 1 is about the rights of the people. Article 2, the legislature. Article 3, the executive branch, etc. Article 9 then goes further to outline education, most notably these 2 sections here, which indicates that it is the paramount duty of the state to make ample provisions for the education of all children residing within its borders. And then the other piece of that it gives as a related to education, it gives the legislature the authority to provide for a general and uniform system of public schools. So the Constitution kind of sets out the importance and the prioritization of education as a paramount duty, and then it gives the legislature that responsibility for creating what the system is of public schools, of basic education. So within that, we have a whole lot of laws that describe what basic education is. This is when we're looking at the goals of school districts. So when we get down at the local level, the Basic Education Act was established in 1977. So that's the legislature taking their powers and authorities and saying, we are going to define what public schools, what basic education means. It includes things like goals, requirements, distribution of funding, and And then there's been a lot of court cases or court rulings that further kind of get into what does that mean. I'm not going to go into all of those today, but it's very interesting. It's a fascinating road to go down and kind of see how course law has continued to define the role of the legislature and what it means, what basic education means, especially what it means for basic education to be provided to each and every student. The statute has more language than what I put here that I think is really important to us because it talks about basic education being an evolving program of instruction that provides students with the opportunity to become, the language is, responsible and respectful global citizens. And then it also says that the state intends to provide for a system that's able to adapt in order to better focus on strengthening the educational achievement of all students. So I think that's really important because it does say it's not this one thing in time. They established it in 1977 and it's going to look like that forever. A lot has changed since then in what basic ed is and in all of our lives. But it is something that we want to continue to be asking ourselves questions and looking at best research and partnering with other states and with local communities on what it means to provide basic education. Okay, so the goals of school districts, there's 4 primary goals that are in statute. So I have the RCW there, but the key goal is, oh, was there a question? Oh, no, okay.
I'll just ask everybody, sorry about that. If everybody could mute your microphones, I'd sure appreciate it. And then if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. Thanks, Jenny. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's okay. At the last one, somebody was shouting the name of their dog, which I loved because okay. So the goals are here to provide opportunities. This is the responsibility of school districts for every student to develop the knowledge in schools essential to read with comprehension, write effectively, communicate successfully in a variety of ways, to know and apply the core concepts and principles of math, social, physical, and life sciences, civics and history, different cultures and participation in government, geography, arts, health and fitness, to think analytically, logically, and creatively and integrate technology literacy and fluency into all of it, as in addition to kind of critical thinking and problem solving, and to understand the importance of work and finance and how performance, effort, decisions affect future career and educational opportunities. So as you're hearing this, these are very big, broad goals. There's a lot of other numerous statutes describing the required elements of a program of basic education. There are kind of the foundational elements, so the 180-day school year, minimum instructional hours, things like that, about what the minimum kind of structural requirements are of basic education. There are specific statutes related to offerings that are required, and the law puts those into the basic ed kind of box. Arts instruction, temperance and good citizenship, the standalone civics course are some of those. And then there's additional things that are required legislatively, but they might not be so like explicitly baked into basic education. I think there's always the question of what a court would rule if it were challenged. But like since time immemorial, financial education, where those are required, things that are required by our state, but not specifically put into the context of basic education. So that's the goal of school districts. Let's look at the duties of OSPI. So the legislature grants OSPI with a lot of responsibilities. They center around, if I want to go higher level, most of what I'm going to talk about today is trying to put the context of learning standards. But if we step up one level, OSPI is responsible for general supervision of all matters pertaining to public schools. So that's, I mean, what supervision means. There's been conversations with the courts of what that means. We collect data, we report information to the legislature and to the governor's office, teacher certification, promoting the adoption of school-based curriculum and policies. So promoting, we don't do it, but we promote it. Getting funding out to districts, developing rules, standards, guidance. There's there's a lot of things that OSPI is responsible for, but those are kind of the high level: funding, guidance and rules, implementation. There's some monitoring requirements, some of which are federal, a condition of receiving federal funds, and then some that are built into kind of our system of basic education. Related to the learning standards, OSPI has specific responsibilities to develop learning standards that identify the knowledge and skills that all students need to know to meet those goals that I had on the prior slide, to periodically revise the learning standards as needed based on the goals that are in that statute, to include a screening for biased content in each development or revision of the learning standards to ensure that the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion are incorporated into each revision, and then to review and prioritize the learning standards and identify with concise descriptions the grade level content expectations. So OSPI's responsibilities in a nutshell are to develop the state learning standards and to periodically update them. So getting into kind of what are learning standards, and this helps to give the context of like, what is school board's responsibility related to learning standards? So learning standards are the big, and there's a lot of text on this page, sorry, but I do plan to give these slides to you so that you have them. They're the goals for instruction identified for each content area. So like math, science, the goals identify what students should know, understand, and be able to do by the end of that grade level or grade band. That in comparison to curriculum, which I think these terms are often interconnected in conversations. I know we're always answering questions about like, what is the state required curriculum, when people are really asking what are the state required standards? Because as we know, there isn't one state required curriculum except for since time immemorial and different thing. But so curriculum is the structure of content and the materials that support the teacher and the student. So there's teacher guides and things like that, or curriculum that students actually engage with. And it helps to provide that sequency over time and can be modified to meet individual learning standards for students. But it takes the learning standards and applies them. So going back to what are learning standards on the left, teachers use the learning standards as goals for the student learning when they use curriculum to support the instruction of the learning standards. So not all curriculum is aligned to the learning standards. There can be supplemental materials and things that are outside of that, depending on the local district goals and even down to individual educators. Going back to the left, so learning standards are developed at the state. OSPI develops learning standards with a lot of input from different partners around the state. Heavy focus on educators because they are the users of the standards. Educators are the ones who are really engaging and taking the learning standards and applying them. But we do want to make sure that the learning standards are reflective of those larger goals of basic education and what our communities and what our legislature are wanting to see in education. But I think in the past, as different sets of learning standards have been adopted and developed, they've gotten a little bit unwieldy, maybe. There's a lot of documentation, there's a lot of different standards, which is good. There's more information than educators could ever want right now on learning standards. So you'll see that as part of our focus this year and how we are trying to really focus the learning standards and have them be interconnected so that it's a more smooth and comprehensive tool for educators. So learning standards develop at the state level. Curriculum is selected at the local level. So local school boards, all of you, select and adopt the curriculum for the schools based on state requirements and then local district policies and procedures. So there are processes for selecting it that include, bringing in the public or having kind of a review committee. So curriculum is adopted at the local school board level. Standards are set at the state level. So the current standards review project goals. So we, as I mentioned, really are trying to refine, prioritize, and clarify existing standards. They've all kind of just stacked on each other as they've been developed and selected over the years. We also want to develop wraparound guidance for educators that talks about cross-content integration, social-emotional learning, language development, universal design, a lot of these other pieces that are really critical when we're looking at what our system needs to be in order to be responsive to the students that we serve. Establish a uniform process for the periodic review. I have a slide that will show you that, but it's for so long we were getting new kind of standards, the environmental sustainability standards. We had a project to work on, and we got to the point where it had been almost 10 years since our main content areas, so ELA, math, had been revised. So we want to get on a more routine schedule so that we are planning for and preparing for those standards revision processes. It also signals to our partners at the state board and the legislature so that we can all kind of have a plan in place and know what updates are coming up, so that we can work together to make those smooth, because it's a multi-year process to update the standards. Yeah, and then the multi-year plan to support educators, which if educators are supported in implementing these new standards, what is it all for? So here is the review and revision cycle in a nutshell. This content area standards are down the left side column with a little image, and then the years go across the years go across the columns from left to right. The different little icons is sort of indicating the process of updating standards. You start with a review, so you go down and pick it all apart and look at it. Then you hit the adoption target, which is when the new standards will have been revised. So you review them, decide what changes are going to be made. You have the target for when the target is going to be made available to the public. Professional learning and transition, implemented in schools, and then the assessment changes come after that. So that's a question that we get frequently too. Does the assessment drive the standards, or does the standards drive the assessment? And it's definitely the standards drive the assessment. And then the new revision begins as that kind of cycle. So we're in this grouping right here of ELA, math, and science. We'll be picking up health and physical education, world languages, and financial education in the next round. That is starting now. But that's kind of where we are in the bigger revision cycle process. I'm gonna skip over this one probably just for sake of time, because I want to make sure we have time to go through kind of more process, but this gets into more detail and I could go way deeper. I already deleted a bunch of slides from this deck in what that means when we're looking at pulling examples from content of what the specificity looks like, what it looks like to prioritize and clarify. This just gives some examples. Here's I pulled high-level summarized content overview. So math builds from Common Core mathematics standards, which we have adopted, and it adds specifically standards in data science. So that's one of the new focus areas that we're building in our math review. Science pulls from the next generation science standards, which these are bigger standards that are used in multiple states often, and it embeds the environment and sustainability education standards. I mentioned that earlier. That was a new requirement that we add standards for those, and they were a set aside. So it's one more document, one more set of standards. So we're now embedding those in and making explicit climate science connections so that they're all a part of the science standards. ELA built from the Common Core standards, same as math, and adding really specific focus in media literacy and digital citizenship, as well as early literacy. So there's a lot of research that has happened in the last 10 years and data that we have around what early literacy looks like in ELA. So being more explicit about those components. The prioritization is focusing on streamlining, being responsive to educator feedback, district need, what we're hearing, data that we're seeing. So it's a universal set of standards that all students should have the opportunity to develop and meet those goals of basic ed. And then there are some kind of tangential areas that are helpful that is up for local districts to figure out how to embed those in. There's the common state assessment data does not determine priority standards. Assessments are adjusted as needed after adoption. So that process will come later. That's the timeline. I'll just make a note because it's really important. I think that we are right here in this August. So we've already done the review, revision, and amendments. We've had multiple feedback rounds from a lot of different groups across the state, educators, ethnic commissions, advocacy organizations, and different community partners who are working with schools, various associations and their representatives. Made final revisions in July. Now we're at the point where we're in the public survey feedback. So we do want to make sure that the public understands what the purpose of standards are, what students should be able to know and do, and we'll take that input and make one more round that will happen through September. It actually was extended a little bit. The survey goes through tomorrow or Friday. Tomorrow is Friday. Go through tomorrow, and then we'll do another round of final edits and start translating all of those and getting those ready to roll out to schools. And the superintendent plans to adopt in December. Some of the products, this I think is getting into what can school boards do to support. So I want to make sure you're aware of some of the products and things that we're developing to support educators. Awareness is probably the biggest thing as you head into those curriculum adoption conversations at the local level, having awareness of what the standards are and how they're used, engaging with your educators on what they're seeing as the needs for what content and curriculum is necessary for them to be able to implement, and make sure our students all know and are able to achieve those basic goals of education. So we will have a document that just describes it. So it'll be really helpful for use when communicating to the public, to parents, to legislators, to anyone, of like, what are learning standards? What are the priority standards? What do we want our kids to be able to know and do? There will be a family grade level resource guide that your districts will be able to provide to their families. Teacher implementation guides to support that work, and then a lot of crosswalk documents so that help to identify the changes, again, just so that that implementation is smooth. In addition to that, there will be some unpacking documents. So like unpacking the ELA standards, unpacking the math standards. There will be similar formatting across the content areas. So when you switch from math standards to ELA standards, it won't be such an abrupt, like they're structured completely different, labeled completely different. You'll see some of that formatting, which I think will be helpful for all of you and others in the district who maybe don't engage with the standards as much, to be able to kind of figure out how to read them and how to use them. We'll have examples, guidance, connections to previous and future learning, just to, again, to make that easier. And then the standards will be grouped and bundled that can actually be taught together. A lot of you are exploring more mastery-based options and looking at how you provide education in a more kind of fluid environment. So we really think this round of standards and the tools that come with them will help facilitate those decisions, that you won't be like, ELA happens in this classroom with this educator. We can be a little bit more fluid in those. We will also have family caregiver guides that are for, we don't give them directly to the families. We give them to you all to be able to share with your families, to make sure that they have what they need to navigate what their learners should be learning and doing, and what's happening at school, and kind of what the processes are. Okay, I think that's kind of it. I do have more if we need to get into well, here's the public comment. It's available through tomorrow. We're getting a lot of really good feedback. The links are there. This also takes you, so you can actually go and review the standards if you haven't yet and are interested. We welcome that. And then we will be compiling the feedback, making final revisions and adjustments, and then getting those launched after December, and professional learning begins in 2025, so next fiscal year. And we do have a request to the legislature for more robust funding to support the implementation in a stable way, with a focus on early literacy and media literacy in the first 2 years, and then consistent, stable funding, so that as this whole revision process is happening and new standards are being adopted, the districts get ample funding to be able to allow their educators to engage in the professional learning to update materials as needed. So that's it. I think I'm good on time. I think I was supposed to go till 12:30.
Great. I mean, this is such important and meaty content. We do have a couple questions, but before we get into the questions, I just want to recap kind of in a nutshell for just some common understanding amongst our members, because oftentimes there's confusion about who has authority to do what. Just as a reminder that the Washington State Legislature, your state elected officials, have essentially granted authority or directed authority to OSPI to develop the state learning standards, the overarching what students should know and be able to do for K-12 by content areas. So it is the state legislature who has the authority to say who's responsible for developing the standards, and they have given OSPI those that authority. So I think that's important just to remind you all. In addition to that, they have given the authority to local school boards to essentially adopt curriculum who meets those learning standards. The learning standards are pretty broad, generally speaking. It's basically what the students should know and be able to do. And the curriculum is how the teachers will help students get there, essentially. So just remembering that learning standards are sort of the what, and curriculum is kind of the how, and there's different authority placed for OSPI and school boards based on those different categories. Did I capture that okay, Jenny? Any corrections you'd make to that?
Nope, that was perfect.
Great. There was a question about where to see those standards. There was a slide that you just showed towards the end of your slide deck that actually had some links. So for the person that asked that question, we will share the slide deck with all of you. And within that slide deck are links to access the draft learning standards as well as all the existing learning standards that have already been adopted and are yet to be revised.
I
There was
closed the PowerPoint so that I could put those links in the chat right now, so I'll do that.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much. Then there is a question about does OSPI, and if not, why, create a list of curriculum that meet the various learning standards by content area?
We do not. I think it's the main reason is we're not resourced to do that or tasked to do that. I think there's so much curriculum out there. We do in a lot of our content areas are like math experts, our ELA experts, they are aware of the curriculum that are available and that districts are using. So if you ever need kind of a where should I start or what are other districts doing kind of thing, our content experts here can give you that. It's just we aren't tasked with doing that, so we don't. There are a few places where we do, since time immemorial is one where that is a required curriculum, so we do have responsibility in developing and updating that and making it available to districts. The other one is comprehensive sexual health education, that was the legislature tasked us to do a review of what curriculum is available and do a standards alignment thing. So we still don't, if a district picks one that isn't aligned to standards, we don't really have a role other than notifying them, like, just so you know, this isn't aligned to the state standards. But we do have a list in that subject area because the legislature tasked us to, of which curriculum have been kind of pre-vetted or pre-reviewed and do align to the standards. We also take input. So if there's a new curriculum out there or a curriculum that your district wants to use, you can submit it to be reviewed. And we have a team in partnership with the Department of Health because there are health elements in the required comprehensive sexual health education law that do that review to see if it is in alignment with what the legislature has tasked us to. So that's one example. The last thing I would say is we do have the Open Educational Resources Hub that we house through OSPI, and that's somewhere where anytime there is materials, curriculum, resources that are available at no cost, we make them available in a place where you can search by subject area, you can search by kind of keyword, and if it is a free resource, it's housed there. And we do some like bias and sensitivity reviews. In some places we have identified which content areas they align to, but it isn't a requirement. It's just kind of a helpful tool to draw those connections. So that is another thing. A lot of the curriculum that you all use is for charge though, so we don't post it there. That's all for free resources.
Yeah,
So it's mostly that our work is directed by the legislature. So unless they tell us to do that, we don't have staff that are sitting around waiting to do extra stuff.
You don't have the capacity, not to mention the fact that depending on the content area, although probably this is true for all of them, just the breadth of curriculum that's available out there, inevitably you'd miss something and get in trouble for not reviewing something and having it on the list too. So it's a little bit of a lose-lose prophecy, because there's so many curriculum available. And oftentimes a resource, a curriculum, or a supplemental material will meet some of the standards, but not all of the standards in a given grade level or content area. So there's a necessity at the local level to really consider how to meet the learning standards by combining more than just one tool or resource. So again, why it's so important at the local level to engage your content area experts, because your math educators will really understand what it means to implement the learning standards through curriculum and materials in a way that most of us are just not expert at doing. So really important for you to engage in the local level. One more question, and we could talk about this forever because it's a little philosophical in nature. How do we evaluate whether or not students are meeting the standards?
Yeah, so we do have our state assessment, which is one tool. That is one. A lot of the curriculum comes with interim assessments and assessments that you can use to monitor. So I think if that alignment is there, educators have resources that they are using continuously through the school year to say, are our kids meeting the standards? And then we have other places where we look at the bigger picture, kind of statewide assessment and things like that. I think the important thing to recognize is all of our kids are on a continuum. And so even our state assessment is divided into 4 levels. Level 2 being meets grade level with limited complexity. So they're still at grade level. It's like once you start adding, that's how the assessments work, is they build on different complexity and are bringing in other things around critical thinking and that kind of stuff. So we ideally want our kids to get up into the 3s and the 4s, but level 2 even is they have that grade level knowledge. It's just the complexity that's building. And as you get into level 3, it's like able to demonstrate grade level with more layers of complexity. So the question of, ideally every single one of our students do. The 3rd grade checkpoint is a time for us to say, what are we missing? How do we make sure that those students get the additional resources and supports they need? But typically as students move through the system, the kind of success rates and the rate we're able to get them to meeting the standards grows the more kind of time they're with us. So I don't know if that answers the question. I could probably talk about this all day. I think it is kind of
We could talk about this for ages and ages. Thank you so much.
These are really good conversations to be having with local school boards too, as you set goals for the district and create like your kind of strategic plan for what your district's going to focus on, bringing in data and looking at, how you're implementing curriculum and what the educators are focusing on. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. We are beyond time, and I want to give Alyssa and Jay Lee from the State Board of Education the opportunity to move us into graduation requirements and graduation pathways, another very important issue or issue areas as it relates to your proposals and member adopted positions. So with that, I'm going to pass it to you. Alyssa, I think you're presenting to us first. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Marissa. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alyssa Muller. I'm the Director of Policy at the State Board of Education. I'm going to try to go a little bit fast to try to make up some time and make sure we still have time for your questions. Today, I'm going to kick us off by briefly reviewing our current graduation requirements, including some recent updates in that area, before turning it over to my colleague, Jay Lee, to talk about the board's Future Ready initiative. So as most of you know, in Washington, we have 3 big components in the state graduation requirement framework that work together to signal that a student is ready for success in post-secondary education, gainful employment, civic engagement, and lifelong learning. Based on the student's high school and beyond plan goals, a student will choose how to meet the subject area graduation requirements, as well as choose which graduation pathway option makes sense for them based on their post-secondary plans. Next slide. So we have 17 foundational or core credits in the state graduation requirement framework, and then we have 7 elective credits. 3 of those are personalized pathway requirements. So we recommend that a student takes a second ARCH credit and then 2 global language credits. But those can change based on the student's goals for after high school and what electives might make the most sense for that student. Next slide. As you can see, the graduation requirements align fairly well with the college academic distribution requirements, which are the minimum college admission standards, although of course each university can set additional requirements for their campus. What isn't included on this slide is that students are also required to take a math-based quantitative course during their senior year. However, students who have completed math beyond Algebra 2 or integrated math 3 prior to their senior year are exempt from this requirement. Next slide. So I'm sure all of you remember House Bill 1599 that in 2019 established the graduation pathway options. And then last year, House Bill 1308 added the new performance-based pathway that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about today. Next slide. So the performance-based pathway option really came about based on stakeholder feedback that we needed a graduation pathway that was more student-centered and that was intended to be a little bit more customizable. So the performance-based pathway really allows students to show what they know and can do in real-world, hands-on ways that align with their individual goals for life after high school. It's a really flexible pathway because it can take a variety of forms. So the student could do a project or have a work-related experience, community service, or a cultural activity. That could result in a variety of different types of student work that can be evaluated. So, for instance, a performance, a portfolio, a report, a film, or an exhibit. And then, depending on how the district sets up the performance-based pathway, it may or may not be completed as part of a class where the student also earns credit. Next slide. So the performance-based pathway really has 2 different components as far as you all might be concerned. There's the district policy that has certain requirements that I'll talk about, and then there's the requirements for the student learning experience itself. So for the district policy, it really needs to include a process for how student learning experiences are going to be approved. It should cover if the district allows for both student proposals and learning contracts or just one of those. So, a student proposal for a learning experience would be created by the student with the help of an advisor, or some districts might choose to set up a more general learning contract created by the district and then approved by the student. So, in other words, a student can create the experience themselves, or a school can create that experience and then have the student customize that through the learning contract process. So, for instance, I've heard of some districts that are thinking that they would just build the performance-based pathway into their ELA senior year course so that every student might have an opportunity to meet that pathway requirement through their senior year ELA course. And that might be a good case for having a learning contract at the district level. For the student experience, this has to include the proposal or learning contract that outlines very specifically the state required focus standards in math and or ELA that the student would meet, as well as the locally determined focus standards the student would choose with help of their advisor, depending on if the student is using that performance-based pathway to meet their pathway requirement in just ELA or just math or both. The product to be evaluated must also include a reflection on how the learning experience aligns to the student's goals as described in the student's high school and beyond plan, and a self-evaluation on how the student really gained skills and knowledge through that learning experience. The evaluation of the student product must also involve at least one educator with appropriate endorsement in the relevant subject area. So, for instance, an ELA endorsed educator if the student is meeting their ELA pathway requirement through the performance-based pathway. And per legislation, the evaluation has to include the use of the focus standards and the rubrics that are posted on the State Board website that we collaborated with OSPI to develop. So just a reminder that whether the student meets the pathway requirement through the performance-based pathway is locally determined. This is not like the old collection of evidence that was sent to the state to be evaluated, because we have heard that. It is not. It's locally determined if the student has met this pathway. Next slide. So some districts may have just the educator with the appropriate endorsement do the evaluation, but we've heard of some other districts that may allow for multiple people to sit together on a panel to evaluate the student project. So you want to be really clear in your district policy about what that evaluation process might look like in your district. I think some districts are really interested in a panel because it might allow, for instance, external folks, so not school employees, to be part of that evaluation panel, which might make a lot of sense for students who do a community learning experience. They may want their community member to sit and be part of that evaluation panel. Additionally, the district policy needs to include reference to how you're going to ensure safety of the student learning experience. For example, including a reference to work-based learning rules and industry safety standards, Washington L&I youth employment laws, if applicable, as well as talking about your local district risk management practices. So we worked with WSSDA to create a model policy and procedure for the performance-based pathway, and that's number 2415 if your district hasn't adopted it yet, but is interested in doing so. Next slide. Okay, finally, I wanted to make sure that folks are aware that the emergency waiver of graduation requirements that was available for the first couple of years during COVID is no longer available. So the final year that the emergency waiver was available was last year, the 23 to 24 school year. So that means that there are no longer waivers available for core credits or for graduation pathways. So I know a lot of districts are really interested in implementing the performance-based pathway this year to give their students another option for meeting their pathway requirements. However, I do want to make sure that folks understand that the local 2-credit waiver for individual student circumstances remains. That's part of the 24-credit graduation requirement framework. It's not part of the emergency waiver program, so it will not go away unless there's a statutory change to graduation requirements. So that waiver allows school districts to waive up to 2 of the flexible credits for an individual student based on their student circumstances, but districts do have to have a policy in place first to be able to grant that waiver. So that might be, depending on your district, you could have adopted WSSDA Model Policy 2418, or it might be included in your 2410 more general high school graduation requirements policy. And this waiver can be granted proactively. You don't have to wait for a student to fail a course. It can be part of their plan to graduate with this waiver. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Jay Lee, to take over from here.
Hi, everyone. I am Jaylee Schultz, Deputy Executive Director for the State Board of Education, and I would like to share what's on the horizon for graduation requirements. So back in June, the board adopted its new strategic plan for 24 to 28, and within that plan, there is a strategic plan initiative we're calling Future Ready, which is aimed at comprehensively updating high school graduation requirements through an inclusive and collaborative process. This initiative aligns squarely within the board's statutory authority to establish graduation requirements, periodically re-examine them, and propose changes to the legislature. So this is part of the board's regular business and duty to periodically reevaluate and update graduation requirements. The last time that the board has done a comprehensive review was over a decade ago. And since then, there has been a lot of adds and tinkering, which is something that's putting a lot of strain on the system, as I'm sure you're all feeling and familiar with. And so this is really to get away from the tinkering and the adding and to look at it more comprehensively. I do want to emphasize that the board is not proposing any changes to graduation requirements at this point in time. Instead, the board is proposing an approach to doing the review and for developing the recommendations. And so, as I mentioned, this is the board's regular work, but what we're trying to do is do it in a different way, do it better, based on what we've heard from our partners and from school board directors like you all about the very important need to be hearing from those who are doing the work and from those that it impacts, like students and families, educators, and others. So this approach is designed to be more collaborative and inclusive and more comprehensive with better attention to implementation. So what are some of the problems that we're trying to solve with this? Well, a lot of the work that the board has done in hearing from students, families, and educators, and in different aspects of the board's research and outreach, we hear some consistent themes. So on the one hand, we often hear about the not enough, the skills gap, or students lacking the opportunity to develop critical skills that they're going to need to be successful in a rapidly changing world. So a good example of that is the attention around financial education. We also hear about a lack of engaging and relevant opportunities for students and how important that is coming out of COVID and re-engaging students, as well as with our youth mental health crisis. So really a need for more relevant and engaging opportunities. At the same time, we hear about there being too much, that the tinkering and adding over time has resulted in a framework that is unnecessarily complex, hard to communicate and understand, inequitable, and in some cases too rigid. And these two ideas, not enough and too much, might sound contradictory, but we're recognizing that these can be simultaneously true, which really warrants a comprehensive approach to figuring out how to better balance it. I'm going to breeze through these slides, but this is just to show a snapshot of some of what we do here when we ask the public about their perception of current graduation requirements. You can see common themes of them being confusing, comprehensive, overwhelming. And this is what folks would vision for what they would like the requirements to be in the future, wanting them to be relevant, flexible, and clear. So for the board's initiative, we are wanting to bring together partners to thoughtfully create space for students to develop the knowledge and skills they're going to need. And this isn't just about adding, it's also about rebalancing. So not just about adding things, but really looking at it comprehensively and thoughtfully to create space. This would be a multi-year initiative leading to a legislative proposal, and really holistic, and that the changes will be phased in for well-supported implementation. The approach that we want to take to this initiative aligns with the approach the board adopted in its strategic plan, that is moving toward a more collaborative approach where the policies are designed in partnership with the communities we serve. So we're proposing a task force, a cross-sector group that will help inform the recommendations and really help keep that holistic lens. There would be subcommittees that are focusing in on specific topics, and then community liaisons who are members of the task force that help bring in additional community voices. They'd be doing their own community listening sessions and helping center those voices in the conversation. As far as cross-sector, these are some of the groups that we're talking about: students and families, K12 educators, policymakers, employers, post-secondary education partners, and community-based organizations. And it's important to note that it will be a special focus on target populations that have not been well served by the K12 education system and that have historically been excluded from the policymaking process, and also attention to a range of learning environments, knowing that graduation requirements can pose different barriers depending on the type of learning environment, so needing to be attentive to that as well. I already mentioned some of this, but I want to focus in here talking about subcommittees. So while the task force will be keeping that holistic lens, we see a need for subcommittees that will be providing additional expertise and able to focus in on certain topics. In some cases, that may be subject matter specific, like in the example of financial education. There might be a subcommittee looking specifically at that topic. And we're not intending to reinvent the wheel. We're intending to lean on the expertise of existing groups like the Financial Education Public-Private Partnership, helping support that effort. So that's one example, but also beyond subject matter areas, we also see a need for an implementation subcommittee to have additional and intentional focus on implementation considerations. So then as the task force has questions, they could pose to the implementation subcommittee to ask, we're considering this, and what are some of the implementation issues that we need to keep in mind? And then as the task force moves more into developing recommendations, subcommittees will have an opportunity to review early drafts as they're being developed and be able to critique and provide feedback or raise questions that the task force would then have to address. So this will really help refine and make for stronger recommendations with that more intentional consideration of implementation benefits. And then this is a tentative timeline for the work. And really what we're talking about is on the left-hand side here in blue, the timeline for the Future Ready initiative. So this is going to be multi-phase and span over a couple of years. We are aiming to launch in early next calendar year. We want to begin with level setting, visioning, gap analysis, and scoping to really lay the groundwork and have a shared understanding and vision for the work before moving into recommendations. And then that would be phase 2, developing recommendations. We'll probably have an interim report in December of 2025. Then there will be ongoing work on those recommendations, refining them and turning them into a legislative proposal. So that's what this initiative is really culminating in, is a legislative proposal that would be for consideration during the 27 legislative session. So right now we're just talking about the approach that we want to take to develop that future proposal. We don't have recommended changes at this time. And so what you might really be interested in is the implementation timeline on the right-hand side of what will be the timeline for new changes. We don't know that yet because we don't know what those changes would be. That would be the work of the task force and the informing the board's proposal. So that is to be determined. And I also wanted to emphasize again that with any policy changes that are part of that proposal, there is intentional focus on also identifying the resources and supports that would be needed at both the state and local school district levels for successful implementation, and to develop appropriate and realistic timelines for those changes. With that said, the earliest that any new requirements could take effect would be with an entering 9th grade cohort, the class of 2031, assuming that this task force work follows on track with the timeline proposed. And that would be the earliest. That would have to be requirements that the system's already kind of well set up to implement. For things that are going to be a heavier lift or require more of a building of capacity, we would expect a longer phase and timeline to be built in for those changes. And we do have some legislative requests to go along with this initiative. We have a budget request to ask for some resources specifically to support the community engagement elements of the work with the task force subcommittees and community liaisons. Especially those community liaisons who are compensated members of the task force, who are doing their own listening sessions in their target population communities, bringing in more voices for folks who may not be able to participate on the task force, but wanting to hear more from community members that are impacted by the policies, and bring and center those voices into the conversation of the task force. So that we have a special proposal around that work and how to fund that work that goes kind of above and beyond the state board's regular capacity. And then with this, we also have an optional agency request bill that we are considering whether or not to move forward with. We don't really need a bill for this work because this is already the board's authority and duty to do this kind of work. But we're considering whether it could be helpful to be part of the conversation during session, knowing that there are likely to be other proposals. And I had meant to mention that that is also part of the kind of why now timing to this, is that legislative interest is also growing in adding to the requirements. And just last session, we had 2 bills that would have added requirements, one on financial education and one on computer science. And the board really wants to look at that holistically, not just one subject area, but to really consider how everything impacts everything else, and the need to really thoughtfully create space for anything new, and to consider how things may need to be adjusted accordingly. So we may have a request bill that would lay out our approach, and it basically directs the board to do what we're intending to do anyway, as far as this comprehensive approach. So that might enable us to be part of the conversation during session, but since we do not need the bill, we might end up only moving forward with the budget request and using other communication tools to share about the approach. So we're still deciding on that aspect. And otherwise, we just left some resources in the slide deck to share with everyone.
Thank you, Jaylee. Really appreciate that background and also look to the future. Both are important. We did have a question about the nothing for us without us policy affecting state board's process. Was that taken under consideration intentionally, or maybe it seems like it's unintentional if it wasn't intentional, but my guess is for you it's intentional. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, we are very excited about that legislation, and it has helped. It's one of the reasons we're calling it a task force, because it holds us to the requirements of that act, which we want to be held to. But actually, the approach that the board is proposing goes well above and beyond those expectations. So we would have more members with lived experience participating on the task force than what is required by state law. And then that the additional layers of the community liaison role of bringing in additional listening sessions that are happening in community and bringing that in. That is kind of building on work the board has been doing in the past couple of years to broaden our community engagement efforts. So very well aligned and kind of along the same lines, but I would say kind of going above and beyond what the expectation in state law is.
Thank you. That's helpful. And then not a question from our members, but a question in their hearts, probably whether they know it yet or not. What are you thinking about the likelihood that a financial literacy graduation requirement bill will come back in 2025, and maybe even a computer science, who knows, and then probably some others we haven't even thought of. How does your very intentional and systematic and systemic approach looking forward, that's a best laid plan, but then there are things that are going to be coming at all of us during sessions in the meantime. How will you grapple with all of that?
Yeah, great question. So we are trying to gear up and anticipate the likelihood that there very well may be bills proposing new graduation requirements. And specifically, since we saw financial ed and computer science last session, anticipating we may very well see those again. And as you mentioned, other ideas as well, some that we may not even have on our radar, right? So that is very much kind of part of what we're considering right now around how do we communicate and share information so that legislators are well informed, and our partners, about the board's intended approach, and also to be involved to the extent we can in helping shape any legislation in hopes that it can align with this effort. And so really hoping to see a connection where if the legislature wants to weigh in by creating new requirements, if this process that the board is proposing could be the process that is used to figure out how to fit them in, because that's how we really intentionally get that comprehensive look at, like, not just adding things in piecemeal, like one subject area at a time, but really the need to look at it holistically. So right now we're really thinking a lot about the communications plan around this and how to share out that information, and would love the involvement, from school board directors as well in the resources that we're sharing. We have a one-pager so far. We'll have more resources to come so that we're really well prepared heading into legislative session. And we also have an interest form where folks can fill out and express interest in getting involved.
Nice. Thank you for that. One last question, then we'll let you go. The request bill that you're planning to bring forward, will it increase access and support for students to be on the task force? And if so, how?
Yeah, so the bill is written to require the board to have a task force with representatives from the sectors that were on that slide. So that includes students, and it also has a specific focus on making sure that both on the task force and through other opportunities, that those who are most directly impacted by the policy, and specifically populations that haven't been well served by the education system and that have historically been excluded, would have an opportunity. So that those aspects are built into the request legislation so that that expectation would be the board would do that.
That's great. Thank you so much. Appreciate that thinking. Jaylee, and I think Alyssa's gone. Thanks so much for being here to represent State Board. More to come, but we've at least dove in a little bit more than we have in the past, and hopefully our members are more equipped to have conversations around these topics at our General Assembly next week. Thanks so much, everybody. We're over time, but if you have any outstanding questions for me about General Assembly, which commences a week from tomorrow, please do reach out to me. We have one more of these webinars in the pre-learning series. It's next Tuesday at noon. but it will be more focused on how to participate. So a bit of a test your technology, learn how to use the voting platform. I'll talk a little bit about how WSSDA uses member adopted positions to advocate on your behalf. And then Mike Hoover, our parliamentarian and WSSDA advocacy consultant, will also be with us to answer some questions about Robert's Rules of Order. So thanks again for being here, and look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. I'm obviously and always available if you need me in the meantime. Thanks so much.